Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, April 25th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world. At this moment, the U.S. government is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Furthermore, our government is provoking new wars against countries with nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, Korea, and the South China Sea. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country and controlled the world economy for the benefit of that 1%. In all the years since, U.S. administrations have been willing to kill people and make war to, quote, maintain the disparity, close quote, as American planner George Kennan said. The result was nothing less than 3 generations of American war up to today against people struggling to control their own countries. Since the Second World War, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of them democratically elected, attempted to suppress a populist or national movement in 20 countries, grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries, dropped bombs on people of more than 30 countries, and attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. In total, the United States has carried out one or more of these actions in 69 countries. The enemy changes its name from communism to Islamism, but the U.S. makes war against governments not under U.S. control or influence, or that prevent the U.S. from occupying a strategic position in our campaign to control the world economy. In the years since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people in 37 nations. The U.S. continues to be, in the words of Martin Luther King, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The sheer scale of suffering, let alone criminality, is little known in our country. The most numerous victims of our terrorism are Muslims. 500,000 Iraqi infants died in the 1990s as a result of the embargo imposed by the Clinton administration. And extreme jihadism, radical Islamic terrorism as we call it, which led to 9/11, the attacks of 9/11, 2001, was invented by the Carter administration 40 years ago when the CIA rounded up some Muslim fanatics, armed them, and sent them into Afghanistan, quote, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own, close quote, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Our anti-war group, Aware, was established 15 years ago after the attacks of 9/11, 2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. In those years, the U.S. has attempted, in particular, to exercise military control throughout the Mideast region, but not because the U.S. needs oil from the Mideast, but because Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries, a chokehold which benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%. In 2003, the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq and killed perhaps 1 million people for that purpose, and now has thousands of troops and mercenaries throughout the Mideast. The U.S. government says we're fighting terrorism, but we are in fact creating terrorists in response particularly to our drone assassinations, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, which have killed more than 5,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases, neither Russia nor China has more than 12, bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with Karen Aram.
Okay, I'm going to read an article this morning from the WSWS.org. Excuse me, that's the World Socialist website, which I often find has the most prescient information, as well as accurate and coming from internal sources. Now, this is by Peter Simons. The U.S. Naval Armada menaces North Korea. He says that with tensions on the Korean Peninsula already on a knife edge, the U.S. has dispatched the nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Michigan, to the region. The submarine, which is capable of launching up to 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles from more than 1,500 kilometers, is due in the South Korean port of Busan today. The arrival of the USS Michigan coincides with intense media speculation that North Korea will conduct a nuclear or ballistic missile test to mark its Military Foundation Day. The Trump administration has repeatedly declared that the U.S. will use all options to prevent Pyongyang developing a nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, capable of hitting the American mainland. At the same time, the nuclear aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson, complete with its strike group of guided missile destroyers and cruiser, is headed toward waters off the Korean Peninsula. The Carl Vinson was last reported in the Philippine Sea, where it rendezvoused with 2 Japanese destroyers and will meet up with South Korean warships as it heads north. The U.S. and South Korean air forces are also currently involved in joint war games. The USS Ronald Reagan and its carrier strike group are based at the Japanese port of Yokosuka. Earlier this month, President Trump warned North Korea that the U.S. was sending an armada to Northeast Asia. We have submarines, very powerful, he said. Far more powerful than the aircraft carrier, that I can tell you, he told this to Fox Business Network. Now, Trump reinforced the threat yesterday when he met with the ambassadors of members of the UN Security Council, declaring that the status quo in North Korea was unacceptable. In calling on the UN to impose additional and stronger sanctions, he branded Pyongyang's rudimentary nuclear arsenal as a real threat to the world, a big world problem that we have to finally solve. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, warned that Washington would not ignore North Korea's weapons testing, saying, "The U.S. is not looking for a fight, so don't give us a reason to have one." She again called on China to put pressure on its ally North Korea to halt its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. I'm going to stop here because I think most of us know we do get some of what the mainstream media talks about regarding what Nikki Haley have to say. But this is important now. In a phone call with Trump on Sunday, Chinese President Xi Jinping urged caution. While adamantly opposing any contravention of UN resolutions by North Korea, Xi, according to Chinese reports, hoped that all sides exercise restraint and avoid doing things that exacerbate tensions on the peninsula. Note, he said all sides. The Chinese government is deeply concerned that the U.S. could trigger a war on its doorstep and has been pushing for the resumption of negotiations with concessions both by the U.S. and North Korea. Only if all sides live up to their responsibilities and come together from different directions can the nuclear issue on the peninsula be resolved as quickly as possible, Xi reportedly said. Trump also spoke by phone with Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who told reporters yesterday, "We'll maintain close contact with the U.S. and high level of monitoring and surveillance as we respond firmly on North Korea." You know, but he's not going to communicate with North Korea now, is he? No, he's just going to utilize surveillance. He said that his government agreed with Trump. Of course they do. They're our puppet regime, our proxy regime that we have remilitarized against their constitution. By the way, I'm speaking for myself now. I'm not quoting Peter Simons. I'm just so offended by so much of the propaganda and rhetoric. I'm not going to continue with this other than to point out the seriousness, the very seriousness of that which is not only taking place on the border of Russia, in the Middle East, but also in the South China Sea. And it is the South China Sea, isn't it, Carl, where Korea is?
Well,
yeah. Yeah, anyway, in Asia, let's put it that way, with U.S. provocations against North Korea. And the problem is that people have to recognize what all has taken place. Yes, the North Korean regime has responded with blood-curdling threats to the U.S., which handed Washington a pretext for its military buildup. But if you understand the position that North Korea is in, and Carl, you might be better than I to discuss that in further detail. But I also want to point out that the U.S. is sending our military now to Yemen in regards to the famine. Military. I mean, we're not sending food and supplies, we're sending our military. So now we definitely will have boots on the ground in Yemen. And that means more warmongering, and it just seems to be never ending. And I'm going to stop there and let Carl make some comments.
One thing to be said about the North Korean affair is that we listen to mainstream media in this country, and we have this picture of how did the president put it the other day, the fat boy in North Korea, who's supposed to be crazy and threatening the world with weapons. What's not reported is that North Korea has said, look, we're perfectly happy to discuss a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula if you stop making all these belligerent threats towards us, speaking to the United States. And the United States is unwilling. It's the United States that refuses to discuss the matter, and it's North Korea that offers talks on it. That's important. North Korea's weapons and its own belligerent statements look a little different when we look at what happened in Libya and even in Iraq in regard to weapons of mass destruction, sometimes a synonym for nuclear weapons. In Libya, President Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons, rudimentary as they were, he did have them, at the request of the Bush administration, and then he was attacked by the Obama administration, raped and killed himself, and his government, one of the most progressive in Africa, was overthrown. There's a lesson there. And of course, there's the earlier lesson of Saddam Hussein, who gave up his weapons of mass destruction and the U.S. nevertheless said, we're not sure, and we're going to attack the country. So if you were running the North Korean defense system, it seems to me that you'd want to be sure not to make that mistake, seeing what happened to Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, what happened to Libya and Iraq when it ran afoul of the U.S. government. Korea's behavior in this matter is belligerent in expression, but they're offering the discussions, and the U.S. is avoiding them. So we have to look at why the U.S. wants this wars and rumors of war in the Asian Pacific. As you say, the parallel with what's going on in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines are particularly important here.
Yes.
And the U.S. is once again ratcheting up the belligerence, while the Philippines and China are trying to work out an arrangement.
Well,
So,
I just read something this morning on the, maybe you saw it already, the Asia Times, which is not positive towards China whatsoever, unless Pepe writes an article. He's much more balanced. And that was the fact that they call it the honeymoon between Duterte of the Philippines and China is over. I didn't read further into it, but as I said, I've been rather skeptical of Duterte all along. I think he plays both sides. I think he is a puppet of the U.S., but he knows he's vulnerable, and so he plays both sides. And of course, it's about getting as much out of each one as they can. And when I say he's vulnerable, I actually refer to the nation of the Philippines, as well as all other Southeast Asian nations that are not nuclear armed. So that makes them vulnerable. In fact, this morning I wrote on a friend's article that he had published in the Burmese, working on peace initiatives in Burma between the government, the military government, and the ethnics, rebels. And there are many, many different groups, and he was talking about how, you know, it was in the Japan time. I think the Japan Times. I forgot now which Japanese newspaper, but basically, it's the ethnics are sort of refusing to. What is the word I want to use? Some of them are refusing to talk. Okay, they seem to be very distrustful. And then I pointed out that if you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, and the way the U.S. has treated non-nuclear nations, just as you referred to Libya and Gaddafi, it's no wonder. This is the same basic military government ruling Burma that always has ruled what's now called Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And Aung San Suu Kyi, I think her failure, along with her NLD, to come out and criticize the government killing and murdering of the Muslims, known as Rohingyas, in their nation, slaughtering them, that sends a real lesson to everybody and anybody in that region that it's not a government to be trusted. Just because they got Aung San Suu Kyi in there, and she is a heroine for many, many reasons. I mean, given the house arrest, 23 years that she put up with under the government. But that very fact that she did not speak out, issue, or voice any outrage over that makes her complicit with the government and with the killings. So I side with the ethnic rebels that are, I refer to disarmament. And while they're only talking about peace talks, I think peace talks, the next step would likely be probably, well, they're talking about a ceasefire, excuse me. They're talking about a ceasefire, but the next step to a ceasefire is disarmament. And we know, if we look at what took place when Russia agreed to a ceasefire over Syria, the U.S.-backed terrorists, I will call them what they are, terrorists, just used that to regroup. So ceasefires are very open to suspicion, and any form of disarmament that would follow would likely be disastrous for the rebels in Burma, the ethnic rebels in Burma, who have been fighting, oh, this goes back to World War II. So, and that's why I'm skeptical of any leaders in the U.S., whether we're speaking national or local, that refuse to speak out against war. Today there's a women's march in Springfield, Illinois, and the women have something like the women's groups that organize this, though I'm certain that it's the Democrat Party that was the major organizer. They have something like 12 issues of concern. EPA, you know, I mean, there are a lot of things that are definitely of concern to those who live in Illinois and throughout the nation. One, of course, is animal rights, and I'm an animal lover and concerned with animal rights, but no mention of war. No mention of the killing and slaughtering of women and children, innocents, in Syria or anywhere in the Middle East. I mean, talk about the big white elephant in the room. And any suggestion that that might dilute the issues, I mean, when they've got an issue of animal rights. So I'm very suspicious of any leader, anyone who is not willing to speak out against killing and slaughter and destruction of a nation and of their people. So I now put Aung San Suu Kyi, who for years has been my hero, that I supported, I now put her in the same category as many of the U.S. leaders I see here, and I believe it is due to the fact that the U.S. has a major role in supporting her and the government in Burma.
This is an important point, and I think it's not particularly well understood in the context of American politics, and it should be. One of the reasons it's not particularly well understood is that the Democratic Party in its Obama-Clinton form is doing its best to cover its tracks, to misrepresent what it's doing, and what it's doing primarily is trying to be sure that the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies of the last administration are the very policies that Mrs. Clinton ran in support of are in fact being put in place by the Trump administration, which in the campaign attacked those policies. That's the real struggle that's going on in American politics right now, and we miss the story because it's not being particularly well presented. One of the forms this Democratic program takes is the group called Resistance, hashtag Resistance usually, because most of it's online, that purports to be a continuation of the Democratic campaign uniting Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Resistance to the Trump administration is the way they bill themselves, but it's become a movement to defend basically the Democratic establishment's pro-war policies and to purge anti-war Democrats, the most visible of whom is probably Tulsi Gabbard, the representative from Hawaii, and to support the expansion of Donald Trump's attack on Syria and the expansion proposed, apparently, by the Trump military figures of the war in Syria. This is a very serious issue, and it should be discussed in terms of U.S. war-making, but instead it's a sickly door with a pale cast of thought, and that thought is coming from primarily the Democratic Party. The resistance, as it bills itself, is a self-aggrandizing term for what amounts to a relatively small but still powerful claque of embittered Clinton surrogates. It's been keeping itself busy of late, fanning the flames of McCarthyite recriminations, Just listen to Rachel Maddow and how the Russians are doing it all the time, against anyone who dares question the rather flimsy public evidence that Russia influenced the results of the 2016 election, all the while cheering on President Trump's expansion of the war in Syria, up to and including the Women's March in Springfield today that Karen was just describing. Like its approach to the question of Russia and the election, the resistance will brook no dissent over whether or not President Trump did the right thing in unleashing 59 Tomahawk missiles on a country with which we are not at war and which has never attacked us, that is Syria. As with their hysterical claims that Russia stole the election from Hillary Clinton, the resistance is loath to allow facts, logic, or evidence to get in the way of its view that Donald Trump acted in the security interests of the United States by bombing the Syrian military, which, with air support from the Russians, is currently in the process of routing ISIS and al-Qaeda in Syria itself. Neoliberal Clinton partisan Ruth Marcus at the Washington Post wrote that in her view, quote, Trump is, if not behaving normally, at least adopting normal positions. Normal positions mean killing people in Syria with Tomahawk missiles. Bombing Syria in the absence of a legal mandate from the United Nations or with the expressed authorization of Congress, both legal requirements if the U.S. Constitution and American treaty obligations are to be respected, is, to Marcus anyway, evidence of, quote, Trump's good judgment, close quote. Nor was Marcus alone. Clinton herself endorsed Trump's decision to use force just hours before the attack, telling a crowd of well-heeled resistors, Democrats, in New York that, quote, I really believe that we should have and still should take out Assad's airfields and prevent him from being able to use them to bomb innocent people and drop sarin gas on them, close quote. That's Hillary Clinton, just before Trump's attack on Syria. Former high-ranking Obama State Department officials Antony Blinken and Anne-Marie Slaughter, he in the pages of the New York Times, she on Twitter, also praised Trump's bombing of Syria as, quote, the right thing to do. The New Yorker's Ryan Litson, New Yorker has become just terrible on war issues for a while now, but it's becoming clearer and clearer as the Trump administration is cozened into the Clinton pro-war policies. The New Yorker's Ryan Litson declared, quote, the moral case for President Trump's strike on Syria is uncontroversial, close quote. He may be right, but not in the way he means it, I think. In the days following the Tomahawk missile attack on Syria, it became obvious that anti-war voices need not apply to the resistance. Once again, Karen's example of the local example of that in the Women's March in Springfield today. Became obvious that anti-war voices need not apply to the resistance, which clearly remains in thrall the 25-year-old interventionist orthodoxy begun under President Bill Clinton and which continues to be treated as unassailable dogma within the Democratic Party to this day. Those few who had the temerity to dissent from the resistance party line were to be given no quarter. One of the few prominent elected officials in Washington to voice skepticism of the Trump administration's case for military action against Syria was Hawaii's Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who condemned the attack in a statement which accused the administration of having, quote, acted recklessly without care or consideration of the dire consequences of the United States attack on Syria without waiting for the collection of evidence from the scene of the chemical poisoning, close quote. It would seem eminent sense, but that Gabbard was the only member of Congress to say, current member of Congress, to say it that clearly. The knives came out for Gabbard even before the proverbial ink on the statement was dry. To no one's surprise, the Washington Post, the CIA's favorite paper, quickly ran a smear job by Elise Vieback entitled, What is Tulsi Gabbard Thinking on Syria? Close quote. In it, Vieback declared that, quote, Gabbard has dug herself into a hole in recent weeks with her bizarre but insistent views about Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his country's bloody 6 years of civil war, close quote. But what really seemed to have offended VBAC, and by extension her employers at the Washington Post, was Gabbard's effrontery in committing an act of lèse-majesté against that which all right-thinking people in Washington know, or as VBAC put it, quote, her striking departure from the consensus that Assad's government launched the attack, close quote. It's not clear at all, by the way. VBAC chronicled the resistance's disgust with the Congresswoman's penchant for independent critical thinking. No less a resistance figure than MSNBC's Joy Reid tweeted that, quote, people who have insisted Gabbard is the future of the Democratic Party may need to consider her outre views on issues like Assad, close quote. Other resistance leaders piled on too. The Daily Kos, which is absolutely awful on these matters, Center for American Progress, always a Clinton front, whose president and close Clinton advisor is Neera Tanden, and former Vermont governor and ex-Democratic National Committee chairman Howard Dean, all voiced their opinion that Gabbard should face a primary challenge in 2018. They want her out of the party. Indeed, according to Dean, the health insurance lobbyist, Gabbard should not be in Congress, close quote. Of course, all the hand-wringing over Gabbard's comments are simply another opportunity for the right-minded to double down on their criticism of Gabbard's controversial meeting with Syria's Bashar al-Assad in January. Then, as now, the Washington Post was at the forefront of the character attacks, running a piece by Josh Rogan entitled, quote, How Tulsi Gabbard Became Assad's Mouthpiece in Washington. Yet Rogan's piece was so sloppy and error-ridden that the Washington Post had to append a humiliating paragraph, a paragraph-long correction to it after it was published. Nevertheless, the resistance cry of, what about Assad, is a case of Democratic luminaries polishing up their reputations for virtue and signaling their commitments to career advancements and nothing more. It leaves out the fact that the Syrian opposition also bears responsibility for the start of the violence in 2011. As Father Frans van der Lugt, a Dutch missionary to Syria who was murdered by rebel forces in 2014, put it, quote, from the start, the protest movements, and he's talking about the protest movements against the Syrian government, against the Assad government, that rose with the Arab Spring in 2011 and also because of local conditions in Syria. He said, from the start, the protest movements were not purely peaceful. From the start, I saw armed demonstrators marching along in the protests who began to shoot at the police first. Very often, the violence of the security forces has been a reaction to the brutal violence of the armed rebels, close quote. The murdered Dutch priest also observed as early as 2011 that, quote, the opposition of the street is much stronger than any other opposition, and this opposition is armed and frequently employs brutality and violence only in order to blame the government. Close quote. The what about Assad line also begs us to ignore what the likely consequences of his removal from power would actually mean. Who exactly do they think would fill the vacuum? The obsession with Assad also willfully ignores the immorality of U.S. policy, which involves repeatedly bombing Syria while funding and training violent extremists who seek to overthrow a sovereign government. U.S. policy, wholeheartedly supported by the resistance, tramples international law and makes a mockery of the tenets of the just war theory. It results in violence, death, and destruction abroad and sets the stage for retaliatory acts of violence upon our own people at home. And so in order to ally these considerations, the neoliberal left returns to the eternal tiresome, but what about Assad? To which there is a pretty straightforward answer. Assad is fighting, quite successfully at present, the same enemies who attacked us on 9/11 in an attempt to stave off the wholesale takeover of Syria by Saudi-sponsored Salafists who would, as they promised in the early days of the uprising, drive, quote, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave, close quote. It's a jihadist uprising against the pluralist society that exists in Damascus despite the crimes of the Assad regime in Damascus. Never mind what they would do to women, Shia, and other apostates should they topple Assad and gain power. Anti-interventionist and pro-peace Democrats object to this joint Saudi-Turkish project of turning Syria, which under Assad had been a secular, multi-confessional police state, into a theocratic Sunnistan, thereby carving out a state for our worst enemies. No question, this is not a praise of the existing Syrian state or even what it was 5 years ago. It is a police state. It is a regime in which, in the old days, a decade ago, the CIA would send people to be tortured. In their cooperation, in the Assad regime's cooperation with the CIA in happier days in relationship between Washington and Damascus. The resistance, this Democratic Party group in the United States, may need reminding that international politics, like domestic politics, is about choosing, and the choice that pro-war Democrats, the vast majority of whom are diehard Clinton supporters who still have not been able to reconcile themselves to her defeat, have made is clear. They've thrown their support behind radical Islamist terrorist groups in Syria because they've bought into the tedious fiction about the existence of moderate Syrian rebels. There may have been moderate Syrian rebels when the Arab Spring uprising against the Assad regime began 6 years ago, but they surely have been overtaken by the Wahhabist, the jihadist, the Salafist ideological rebels supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And finally, of course, by the United States. Another trend among the self-fashioned resistors, these Democrats in the U.S., these days is toward an unthinking acceptance of U.S. government talking points, particularly with regard to Russian hacking and the Trump administration's declassified 4-page report on the Syrian chemical weapons attack. Yet given the less than inspiring record of American interventions based on faulty, distorted, or simply fabricated intelligence, as in the cases of Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011, the question isn't why someone like Gabbard is out there questioning the Trump administration's story. The question is, why aren't more doing so? And wouldn't questioning Trump's unilateral, illegal decision to bomb Syria seem to be the right and proper role of something which bills itself as the resistance? But no. As a friend and colleague of mine recently put it, if they were honest, the resistance motto really ought to be, long live the Cold War with Russia, long live neoliberal Wahhabism and chaos in the Middle East, close quote. Yet the resistance drones on, drowning out anti-war, anti-Wahhabi, pro-détente voices, all in a bid to reinforce the neoliberal foreign policy orthodoxy within the Democratic Party in the vain hope of solidifying their positions of power and influence within it. And they have had the remarkable success in recent weeks of converting their severe critic, President Donald Trump, to a wholehearted supporter of their war policy. These are not good times. You're listening to and watching Aware on the Air, and we will proceed from that point.
Okay, Carl, who was the name of the Dutch priest you were referring to?
His name is Van de Vogt. I'll find it for you in a
never
minute.
mind. I'll tell you what, please just make sure you post this article on Facebook, on our Aware Facebook page.
Van de Lucht.
Yeah, because that caught my attention. I want to mention in respect to the chemical weapons, it has already been proven that the chemical weapons were not coming from the skies. They were not coming, when I say from the skies, they were not coming from Assad's military. His name is Tom Postal, I believe. He's a professor at MIT. I'm not sure if you mentioned that already.
No, I didn't, but it's worth mentioning.
It's very important because he has high credibility, and he has already pointed out that it's very unlikely, it's almost impossible, that they were coming from the Assad regime. And we know that the accusations of chemical weapons use by the Assad government in 2013 has already been debunked, but you don't see anything out there other than U.S., I think, or was it the New York Times, referred to, they declined to refer to that this time in talking about the recent chemical weapons. So we know that they got the message, that it's been proven that it was wrong. We knew it back at the time because Seymour Hersh wrote an article debunking that. But the true information doesn't get out there, and that's what's so wrong. And I agree with you. Gabby, no, what's her name?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard has actually taken up what I call the role that Barbara Lee had taken up initially. She was suggesting bills against the government use of force and weapons supply to Saudi. Suddenly we're not hearing anything from Barbara Lee anymore. And now we have Tulsi Gabbard, and of course Tulsi Gabbard is getting a lot of criticism from the Democrat Party.
Her own party. Yeah.
Her own party, right. But, and you make a good point, Carl. I mean, why is she the only one? Well, I have my own suspicions on that, but
Well, the short answer is that Trump has adopted Clinton's war policy, Clinton's pro-war policy, which the Democrat Party was down with, and Gabbard is a dissenter from that policy. But the Clinton people woke up and said, Trump's doing what we said we would do.
Right, but it's just like Obama spoke out against the Republican war policies at one time, and then everybody supported him as the anti-war candidate, even though those of you who were watching carefully knew better.
Sure.
But for some of us, like me, I was in Shanghai. What did I know? I bought the CNN International News that he was somehow the anti-war candidate and voted for him. That's why I don't pay too much attention to the one lone Democrat speaking out against this, because I see her being groomed for a future position because by that time, I think, by the time the next presidential election comes along, Syria will have already been totally destroyed. And then even if it's been proven that, oh yeah, that was wrong, people will forget because we'll have moved on to North Korea. I want to mention that on the Aware Facebook page, Neil Kaufman, who is a fan, often posts things on our Facebook page. He mentioned that, and I found it here in RT this morning, that the Trump administration has asked every member of the U.S. Senate to meet at the White House on Wednesday for a briefing on North Korea in a rare and unusual move amid mounting tensions with Pyongyang. All 100 senators have been asked to attend the Wednesday briefing, which will be conducted by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Joseph Dunford. White House spokesman Sean Spicer said on Monday. Now, these are all war hawks people. They're Republican war hawks, along with McCain, et cetera, Lindsey Graham, I mean, God, all of them. Although administration officials often travel to Capitol Hill to address members of Congress on foreign policy matters, it is unusual for the entire Senate to go to the White House and for all 4 of the aforementioned officials to be involved. Now, this briefing was originally scheduled for a secure room at the Capitol, but was changed after President Donald Trump suggested a shift to the White House, according to congressional aides cited by Reuters. They've also suggested the briefing is being held at the White House to make clear to North Korea that Washington is serious about a shift in policy when it comes to Pyongyang. So it's scary. It's real scary. And
you wonder what they're up to. It certainly is a very real question.
I mean, a lot of people say, oh, it's all just saber rattling, and maybe it is, and God help us, I hope it is, because if it isn't.
No. And it's important, I think, to see that the domestic politics, the anti-Trump organizations like the Resistance and the Marxists and so forth, and the activities of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as well, really are not very pellucid in terms of what actually is being planned and what actually is going on. And I think you're quite right to put a question mark by this strange meeting in the White House. What the administration is doing is not clear, except for the fact that they seem to have adopted Clinton's pro-war policy. What the Democrats are doing, unfortunately, does seem clear, a continuation of Clinton's pro-war policy. But I've heard one good account of what the war plans coming out of the Trump administration, and that's primarily the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, Mattis and McMaster. I've heard one good account of what their plans might be for Syria. And that is essentially a plan for occupying the areas in East Syria, now essentially controlled by ISIS, as a way to keep U.S. control of the region as a sort of balkanized area where the U.S. can impose its will on all these smaller states, which together might be able to set up some resistance to American control, particularly if they have the sort of support from Russia that the Syrian government has had, and that the U.S. counter to that is perhaps to break up the region, has been proposed occasionally by American officials in the Obama administration. The Islamic State, ISIS, has essentially moved its capital in Syria, is now centered in a place in eastern Syria called Deir ez-Zor, which has an interesting history in the recent war, but it's 90 miles southeast of Raqqa, the official, the effective capital of ISIS that is under assault by the U.S., the Kurds, and the Syrian government. The move by ISIS, the move to deeper into the desert, basically, corresponds to the secretive massing of U.S. troops and military equipment on the Syria-Jordan border. The U.S. has been moving troops into this region, always announced as a way to support locals against terrorism, but of course in pursuit of American policy in the region, the control of the area that is so well stocked with energy resources. It creates the perfect pretext for a ground invasion of this region, followed by a long-term military occupation in an area that Washington has sought to control for the last year and a half. This is from a group called South Front that writes well on this. Quote, the U.S. military is reportedly concentrating troops and military equipment at the Syrian-Jordanian border. Local sources said that about 20 U.S. armored vehicles, including battle tanks and artillery pieces, carried on trucks were spotted in a place called Al-Mafraq. U.S. troops were allegedly accompanied with the Jordanian Army's 3rd Division. The U.S. Special Operation Forces, the U.K. Special Operation Forces, and units from some other countries have been conducting operations across the Syrian-Jordanian border for a long time. They even had a secret military facility inside Syria where members of the so-called New Syrian Army militant group, one of the rebel groups the U.S. support, were deployed. However, it was the first time when a notable number of U.S. armored vehicles were reported there. The U.S. ship Liberty Passion, loaded with vehicles, had arrived at the Jordanian port of Al-Aqaba a few days ago. These moves followed a meeting between the Jordanian king and President Trump. Thus, the U.S.-led coalition could prepare a large-scale military operation in southern Syria. The goal of the operation will likely to be to get control over the Syrian-Iraqi border and to reach Deir ez-Zor, the supposed new capital of ISIS. It will involve militants trained in camps in Jordan and the U.S.-led coalition's forces. Deir ez-Zor is a strategically located city along the Euphrates that the Pentagon needs in order to tighten its grip on the eastern quadrant of Syria. Once Deir ez-Zor is taken, the U.S. can launch its CIA-backed jihadist militias, the same people we've been supporting all along, the so-called rebels in Syria, back into Syria at will, putting more pressure on Damascus and eventually forcing regime change. In Syria, that is, the ousting of the Assad government. That's the plan, at least. Whether it works or not is anyone's guess. The deployment of troops on the Jordanian border suggests that Washington's proxy army, the mainly Kurdish militia, or SDF, is either unwilling to conduct operations as far south as Deir ez-Zor or doesn't have the military strength to beat ISIS on its own. In any event, the Pentagon needs fresh troops and equipment to succeed, and some of them may well be American. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis presented a preliminary version of the new plan to defeat ISIS in Syria and Iraq, a Pentagon spokesman said on February 28th. The plan submitted by Mattis also includes a proposal to increase the size of the U.S. military contingent to ISIS in Syria. The U.S. admits there are 400 special forces operating alongside the Kurdish attack on Raqqa. There are probably a good deal more, and that doesn't count the so-called contract forces, basically mercenaries, or even the NATO forces that are associated with the U.S. in the area. Without significant U.S. presence on the ground, the SDF, the Kurds, will hardly be able to retake Raqqa from ISIS without incurring unacceptable losses. As to Deir ez-Zor, the U.S. can try to use militants trained in Jordan, those rebels again, to launch an attack on Deir ez-Zor from the southern direction. However, the total failure of this U.S.-backed group in 2016 leaves little chance that it's able to combat ISIS successfully this year. So the U.S. and its allies will be pushed to deploy special forces units or even ground troops to support the advance there. So don't be surprised if you hear announcements of more American forces fighting terrorists in eastern Syria. It's sort of an end run around the plan for regime change in Damascus, which has never quite been abandoned by the U.S. government, either in the last administration or this one. Now, this plan, this end run, this attempt to occupy eastern parts of Syria, the unpopulated, less populated region of Syria, in order to put pressure on the regimes that the U.S. wants to bring under control, most notably the one in Damascus, is perfectly consistent with American policy. American policy doesn't really change. Its tactics change some, from direct assault, say, on the Assad government to with American troops to the use of rebel groups or what have you, or local troops, even Jordanian or even Israeli, to accomplish American goals. But the goals remain the same. The goal remains a military control of the region directly or by cooperative governments in order to make sure that this control of energy resources remains in American hands, where it's essentially been since the Second World War. Some things don't change, and the American government seems to me, in regard to Syria right now, to have learned nothing and forgotten nothing, and people who think that we were going to have different policies because the Trump administration said they were going to be different turned out to be quite wrong, and we got instead the Obama-Clinton policies in the Middle East, as we seem to have gotten the Obama-Clinton policies in East Asia as well.
Yeah, I think, I just hope it's not too late, but I think this has been a very good lesson. There were a lot of people, I watch Crosstalk, I watch RT, there were a lot of people, Americans, British, academics, intellectuals, and former Foreign Service workers that were very concerned, and as a result were supporting Trump simply on the basis that they thought, okay, he wants peace with Russia. That is a very important goal, okay, as opposed to what the Obama administration had been doing and what we knew Hillary would do. So I understood their support for him. You were one, even though we vote for Jill Stein, okay, because we're Greens, but it's to me, it's a good point to show that it doesn't matter who we elect as president, or quite frankly, even which party. We're going to get the same foreign policy supported by the same neocons now primarily as the deep state, because that encompasses all. It encompasses the Pentagon, it encompasses the CIA, it encompasses, all of the neocons out there, and there are quite a few of them, representing corporate capitalism. And my point on this is that unless the American people really rise up against this government system that we have, it's not just Trump. So I do back away when I see people of good faith and good heart resisting Trump and his policies. Even before, when we were resisting Obama and his policies, I back away because I think it's so important that we recognize who and what is behind it. And so if we aren't destroyed in the meantime, because I don't see enough people out there. One of the things that Chomsky said that was of good news is that given all the people who've been out protesting, mass movements, etc., that there is hope. I'm sorry, I don't agree with him, because I feel unless those mass movements are focused appropriately with the proper goal, that's not hopeful. They have to be channeled and they have to be focused for a mass movement to really be of value. So this is where I find myself rather dismayed. And on one hopeful note, I did hear Peter Lavelle on Crosstalk and Mark Sloboda and others and Dimitri saying Russia has thrived as a result of the sanctions that the U.S. imposed upon them. They have become more self-sufficient regarding agriculture, etc., and so they actually welcome more sanctions for them. But that does not mean that poor nations, especially nations that are suffering terribly, should have to endure sanctions. So I just thought I'd bring up one positive note.
The question remains American policy, not only because we're Americans, but because the real problem comes from the United States. Sometimes I think good American progressives who think that the Russians and the Chinese will save us by preventing the worst excesses of American policy, as in Iraq, to continue may be overly optimistic.
Right,
the U.S.
right.
remains the predominant military power in both Europe and Asia, and there is finally no real reason to believe that the U.S. won't use that power, even though it may be declining relatively to some small extent, and it's therefore up to us, as you suggest, to prevent that from happening. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 17th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks, by the way, to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scollery, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware, which, as Karen mentioned, will include references to some of the articles we've been talking about tonight and other discussion of the issues of our concern. Are there upcoming events to announce?
Saturday afternoon, there is going to be in West Park, I think that's right, West Park, the Greens, I think we're supposed to have a table, and this is in respect to climate change, to weather issues. The Sierra Club will be there, and other groups related, I think at 2 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken.
And on the first Saturday of May, the Aware will have its usual anti-war demonstration in downtown Champaign. Come from 2 to 4 p.m. Come by, discuss the matters, and say hello, and see our signs and posters. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.